Is civilization a sinking ship? And if so, why polish the brass on this sinking ship? That's our topic on today's Vantage Point. Welcome.
Vantage Point is brought to you by American Vision. For more information on today's show, check out Last Days Madness, Obsession of the Modern Church. You will find it at AmericanVision.com.
So, is civilization a sinking ship? Joel?
I think it's not, but I think the reason that question comes up is a very important one today. We just did an article on it last week and had a lot of response to it. It is something you hear all the time, especially from Christians, and it stems back to a metaphor used in the 1950s, or at least by a preacher who was famous in the 1950s, J. Vernon McGee. And it really is kind of a symbol of the dispensational or premillennial end-time system where there's this fixation on everything becoming waxing worse and worse, is the phrase you always hear. And therefore Christians' only job should be the saving of souls, and Christians should not get involved in social institutions, politics, economics, things like that. And it's a stark divide between the two. Any Christian who says we should spend time on institutions such as education, things like that, are not only corrected as if they're doing something wrong, they're condemned as if you're countering what the gospel's really all about. No, we need to understand this, they would say, that civilization is a sinking ship, and you don't polish the brass on a sinking ship.
And we're going through a process of bringing up to date my God and Government series, which came out in 3 volumes in 1982, 84, and 86. And in the process, and a lot of people don't realize that one of the reasons I got involved in politics is I went out and spoke on worldview issues, and particularly on the topic of government. Again, government is not solely equated with politics. It's one aspect of government, and I lay all this out in the God and Government series, and it'll be out in a new edition in the next couple of months. Invariably, I'd find somebody in the crowd who would say, but wait a minute, Mr. Tamar, why are we bothering with all this? Because Jesus is coming back soon, things are supposed to get worse and worse. And so people always ask me when they write to me, says, why are you bringing up the issue of eschatology, Bible prophecy, with all your other worldview issues? Well, it's not something I pursued at the start. It was something I had to answer because people kept bringing it up. Yeah. And this latest issue came about because Brannon Howse, H-O-W-S-E, for those of you who want to Google his name, Brannon Howse, for the last few years has been publishing articles dealing with eschatology, a fairly heavy number of articles dealing with eschatology while he's dealing with worldview issues. And I was critical of that approach, and in private correspondence with Brannon, I made that known to him that I was critical of. I thought it was very schizophrenic. Here he goes in there and he starts talking to the kids about worldview issues, and he brings people in and has articles on his site talking about how the end of the world is right around the corner and signs of the rapture and on and on and on. And then a few weeks ago, he published a 1987 article by Dave Hunt on Dominion theology, which Peter Leithart and I dealt with back in 1988 with a book that we wrote called The Reduction of Christianity. And it's as if Brannon and that whole group of speakers has no idea, but they do have an idea that
they know better.
That this stuff has been answered over and over and over again. And then he wrote a pretty nasty and ill-informed and uninformed response to my to my article in response to the Dave Hunt article. That was a whole series of red herrings and straw men, and then he. In that particular article, this, is the world a sinking Titanic, was an article that was published on his website, and so that's why we're bringing this up, because we believe eschatology is extremely crucial. Every worldview has an eschatology. Islam has an eschatology. That's why they're so optimistic about the future.
Absolutely. I mean, and this is probably the most ubiquitous phrase in Christian eschatology. It's just they've gotten so much mileage out of this image of the civilization as a sinking ship. And so I just wanted to step back and say, okay, let's think about this for a moment.
And I know where you're going with it. I want you to go with that. But it's a pretty slow leak. This is the thing. If you go through history,
For 2,000 years.
right? How have people been? They may not have used that same metaphor,
Yeah.
but they've used something very similar to that metaphor.
Day of Doom.
Yeah, all of the. So okay, on the Titanic, it didn't take long for the Titanic to sink, but you could, given their penchant for talking about how the end is near, you could have been polishing brass on a sinking ship if it's taken at this point 2,000 years to sink.
Yeah, you could have built several more ships in the meantime to unload it.
Yeah, right, gotten them all off. Exactly. Now, biblically, Joel, you've done an interesting work on this in terms of what the Bible has to say about sinking ships.
Absolutely. Well, just think about it from the biblical perspective. What is the biblical image when a ship is involved? It is of Noah's Ark, remaining afloat while everything else drowns. It's just the opposite of you shouldn't be involved in society. It is the unbelievers who perish. It is the Christians, it is the believers whom God saves through the midst of the storm. You see the same thing in the crossing of the Red Sea. God uses the floods and the waters to destroy the enemies and their armies. And of course the same thing as the illustration I really like is with Jesus crossing over in the boat in Mark 4. And he's asleep in the boat, and the disciples, this big storm comes, and the disciples get scared to death, and they run back, and it must have been a fairly large ship, I suspect, at least relatively speaking. And it's interesting, the text says he was asleep on a pillow. So I mean, he was out for the duration. In the midst of this storm, and these guys come running down there, and they have, Jesus, Jesus, don't you care that we perish? I mean, he rebukes them for not having faith. Being faithless, and to me that is a perfect image of what's going on today. You have these dispensationalists who just see all kinds of, they can see nothing but evil around us.
Everything's a storm.
Everything is the storm, and the waves are coming over the bow of the ship and everything else, and we're inundated, and we're just waiting to be rescued. And it can only be overcome when Jesus is physically present, so we have to go to Jesus. And yet that is just the opposite of what the whole story teaches. It is faith in Him, faith in His Word. And of course, when you get to the Great Commission, He gives the Great Commission to go out and baptize the entire world, which is
the sea. The sea.
The sea. I mean, it is used exactly in Peter in that way. There's that the flood, Noah's flood, was an image of baptism. It is the killing of the old man and the resurrection of the new man. And we're to do that to the entire world. And it says, lo, I am with you always. Even though He ascends into heaven and He's sitting at the right hand of God, we are to carry out that enterprise of making disciples of all nations while His presence is in heaven. Not waiting for Him to come back to earth so that this can happen, but doing it through His power, through the power of the Spirit, while He's where He is now. So it is an act of faith, it is optimism, the ship is staying afloat, it's not sinking, and we're to carry out that mission.
Yeah, and the idea that the nations are the sea, I mean, this is imagery that's throughout the Old Testament. It's interesting that Jesus does not pick farmers. Like in the Old Testament, all these farmers, everybody's associated with the land of Israel. In the New Testament, you find that Jesus picks fishermen. You're going to be fishers of men. You're going to go out into the sea.
Yes.
And then there's that great illustration in the book of Acts when, Paul is in the ship being taken to Rome,
right,
and he's being battered by the waves, and they're throwing everything overboard. Everything's going overboard, but Paul says, stay in the ship.
If you want to live.
You want to live, you stay in the ship.
Yeah.
Now the ship does in fact break up upon hitting the land, but everybody is saved.
Yes, by the pieces of the ship, by the
yes.
way. Hanging on to the pieces of the ship.
This is an extremely important point. And the other thing in here, Joel, you remember that Jan Markell, who wrote this article
well,
about...
before you move on too far, I just wanted to add to what you were going to say, that the whole imagery, the idea of fishers of men, comes out of Old Testament prophecy. Ezekiel 40, I believe, I could be wrong about the exact chapter, but it's the description of the temple and the waters flowing out in every direction from the temple. And it basically says that, and you will stand on the sides of the rivers and cast in your nets and catch the fish. And of course, this was an image of the evangelism to come. And of course, Jesus uses that very image of the temple to apply to the people in John 7 when He says that anyone who believes in me, essentially, out of their bellies shall flow streams of living water. He's alluding to that image of the temple, out of which is flowing the water, and then He calls us to baptize all nations. I mean, all those things fit together in biblical imagery.
Yeah, in the second Timothy 3, it really, if you read that particular chapter, Jesus is saying that the unbelieving world is the one that will not make further progress, for their folly will be obvious to all. Their ships are constantly sinking. They're always trying to figure out ways to plug the holes. And what we're telling them to do is get onto our ship. The ship is Christ. To be in Christ is to be in the ship. And civilizations are changed as a result of all that.
Yeah, and historically the church applied that to the physical church building. In the part in which everybody sat in pews was called the nave, and still is in most churches that are designed that way. And of course the word nave was used because it meant ship. It was the Latin word for a ship, and it's where we get our word navy from. So the church was aware of this imagery long ago.
Yeah, a lot of these churches, the architecture of the church, you look up into the ceiling, it looks like a ribbing. You're in Christ, like the ribs of Christ's body, you're inside, and if you were to turn that upside down, you would be in a ship. And so Jesus is in fact the ship. So we're trying to tell the world is to get into Christ, and that is the imagery all through the Bible. Get in the boat, stay in the boat. This idea that that this is a sinking, America is a sinking ship or civilization is a sinking ship, is nonsense. It's the humanistic ships that are sinking. And in this particular article, Jan Markle brings up the point: we're not in the business of saving anything other than saving souls, taking them away from Satan.
Yeah, which I think is hilarious.
So what if they're successful and they save all the souls in the world? Then what?
Then what? Well, exactly. You could have, according to their view, you could have 99% of the world Christianized, 1% non-Christian. They would say that it's okay for that 1% to run the world because we have nothing to do with any of this down here because this is Satan's world. All we're supposed to do is take souls away from Satan.
No other enterprise could be successful with that kind of a vision or lack thereof.
And besides, I mean, in Romans 16, Paul tells those believers at the time that God was going to crush Satan under their feet soon.
Yes.
So apparently they weren't just in the business of just taking souls away. God was going to crush him under their feet completely. And then, of course, there's a lot more of that throughout Scripture as well.
Despite the fact that people have a wrong eschatology, the church does march on, and Christianity is making advances in the world.
No, it is, and you can't understand civilization unless you understand Christian civilization. What sprang out of Christian civilization is the world that we know today, and of course, Christians who continue to deny that is giving aid and comfort to the enemies of Christ. They're allowing them to have their way in the world, and it's contrary to the gospel. It's contrary to the directives of the Bible.
Now there is one society that they do care about very much, and that is that little piece of real estate over in the Middle East. Now they can build institutions and temples and everything else. That would be wonderful, but not the Christians.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Good point. Thanks for joining us on Vantage Point.
For more information on today's show, check out American Vision's definitive study on the end times, Last Days Madness, Obsession of the Modern Church, by best-selling author Gary DeMar, the most thoroughly documented and comprehensive study of Bible prophecy ever written. Last Days Madness is your ticket to overcoming the modern rapture frenzy and to escaping the paralysis of Last Days Madness. You will find it at AmericanVision.com.
Do I need to do a sound check?
We're supposed to, oh, this is the show?
This is the show, pal.
I have a little bit, yeah, sure.
Okay.
You want me to get rid of it so we have a clean table?
No, it's okay.